Okay, so today we're going to go over properties and type properties of walls and various aspects that come with it. We will not be getting into wall structure in this video. Wall structure will take a little bit of time to go through, so I wanted to separate that out because it is a fairly important component to building walls and wall types and that sort of thing. So getting right into it, I've basically just created a new project using the architectural or default template here. And if I go up here and click my wall tool, I've got 8-inch generic, and then I have all of these wall types that are come stock out of the box here. I'm going to use this very top one, exterior brick and CMU on metal stud, just so that I've got some layers and stuff built into the walls that I have. So if I draw this wall here, something that may help see the layers a little bit better, if the hotkey TL will turn on and off what's called thin lines. Thin lines basically gets rid of line weights and stuff on your screen so that you can see things that are closer together a little bit better. You'll notice up in this wall tool, you'll see the little picture here has far more layers to it than what I'm seeing here. If I want to see more layers to this, down here at the bottom I can select detail level fine, and then that will show up, give me the opportunity to see all of the layers that are built into this. But if I turn thin lines off, you can see it gets a little bit more muddled and I can't see that exterior layer near as well. So I'm going to keep that turned on. That way I've got the ability to see kind of what's going on with this wall. So if I select this wall, you can see the properties pop up for this specific wall. I've got the location line, which we went over in the last video, how important that is in making changes and things like that later, how that constrains to different things. So if you're interested in location line stuff, I would recommend you look at the drawing wall basics video that I've done. So then beyond that, we have our base constraint. And if we go to an elevation here, we can see that we've got our levels set up. So I'm going to come up here, I'm under the architectural tab, and I'm going to throw in another level, say 12 foot above that one, just so we've got a couple to play with here. So if I have my wall selected, my base constraint at level 1 basically says, okay, what's the bottom of the wall going to be set at? If this base offset is at 0 foot 0, the bottom will be right at level 1. If for whatever reason I want to change the base, so maybe I don't need to set a whole new level if this is just going to be offset 6 inches and it's one of the only walls that does so. So if I say 6 inches off of level 1, the base jumps up 6 inches there. You also have the same exact thing top constraint, so you've got the option to say, okay, I want this to go from 6 inches off of level 1 up to just level 2, and it will jump the top of the wall to level 2. What you're seeing here is above this point is a cap. So if I go to my 3D view here, this particular wall has a cap on the top of it. This wall type does. So the top of the wall they consider to be where the cap is. So if I go back there, you can see that the cap actually starts right where level 2 is. So if for whatever reason you select a wall type that doesn't have a cap on it, so let's say I choose a different wall type here, and let's just go with something simple like a 5-inch generic, and I draw that next to it. So this one, the base constraint is level 1, the top constraint is level 2, and both of those fall right in line with both of those. So both level 1 and level 2. The nice part about these constraints, if for whatever reason you all of a sudden change level 2 to 12 foot, everything moves with it. You don't have to kind of go through and make sure that everything falls in line the same. Same thing with level 1. If all of a sudden I make this a foot different, that 6 inches stays the same. All of the walls in the entire project are going to keep that same association between them based on the constraints and things that you've set up. So beyond that, we also have this base extension. A nice thing, if you ever get confused and you're not really sure what something does, most of the time the tools and everything, if you just hover over it for a second, a nice dialog box will pop up and give you some sort of idea of what this kind of tool is going to do. So this one says hide above or below the wall base for unlocked wall structure layers. So basically, this isn't going to come into play with what we've got here now, but you can disassociate various layers of a wall and then move those up and down. So let's say you had this particular wall type. We could go into the assembly and break apart just the brick that's on it, and maybe the brick actually extends down a little bit further than, say, the stud behind it or something like that. That's particularly nice for floor junctions. So maybe you've got a floor, this wall sits on top of a floor system, but obviously the exterior cladding and stuff is going to extend down to cover the end of that floor system. You can disassociate those particular layers and then move those up and down to extend the base or the top kind of thing. So obviously the top offset does the same thing as the base offset. So 6 inches, we could make the top offset a foot, and that'll jump up based on whatever our top constraint is. Another thing about the top constraint, you have this unconnected. So unconnected, you can set the height of the wall. So I can just punch in and say, I want this wall to be 12 foot all the time, and we're good there. The only kind of problem that you might have with something like this is the top is not going to move with anything else. So if all of a sudden this becomes 12 foot, and you wanted this to all of a sudden say, okay, before this was 10, I want this wall to be an unconnected 12 foot, I want it to be 2 feet taller than my level 2 all the time, that's not going to move when you change this, because you haven't associated this with level 2. Unconnected can be okay at times, but I would recommend always constraining to something and then using your offsets to make sure that everything kind of flows together. That way, if anything were to change level to level, everything kind of behaves the same way. You move it 6 inches, every wall kind of moves 6 inches up or down. So another aspect that we've got here in our properties is room bounding. This comes into play when you're trying to figure out room areas or tagging rooms. The reason that you would turn a room bounding line off are if you have more of a, maybe you've got a semi break in a space, and you put a big door in it or something like that, and you want to see the room areas kind of read as one. You can turn that room bounding off. That way, when you go to tag a room, it'll identify the entire area as a room. It might also work for instances of like half walls. So maybe you've got a 3-foot wall that kind of runs across and divides a space, but you don't want that to actually be considered 2 separate spaces. You can turn off that room bounding tag there and go from there. So relate to mass. So this one's only going to come into play if you use a certain kind of wall creation tool here. So this pick faces kind of thing. So if you have a mass sitting there, you can hit pick faces and create a wall based on the surface of whatever mass you've created. So when you create that, this relate to mass is going to be checked. So if you change that mass in any way, it's going to automatically update that wall. If you check it off and then you update the mass, this is going to stay exactly as the previous mass's surface was. So that's basically what that does there. Structural, you can check whether a wall is structural or not, on or off. This can be particularly beneficial if you're working on remodels, or even in new construction, if you have a team of people that are working on something, and there are certain structural walls that need to be identified as do not move these cannot be adjusted one way or the other. Checking those on just if people are being conscious of what they're doing and they click on a wall, they can always come here and identify whether that wall is structural or not. When you have it as a structural wall, you can also enable analytics and what kind of structural usage it is, all of that sort of stuff that can come into play when you're using creating a structural model off of this. So then beyond that, you also have some general information that comes into play, whether you want to know how long a wall is, the area of it. This can be decent, not fantastic, but okay for pulling off like surface, like cladding, material takeoffs and things like that. I would never probably trust this to a huge extent, but if you're trying to get a rough idea, not a bad way to go. Identity data, you'll see this in pretty much every component that you create within Revit, and this just gives you a chance to identify exactly what this is. So you can select, you could upload an image here, and maybe that image pertains to an interior surface cladding that you're using or an exterior cladding that you're using. Maybe it's some sort of special system that you're using to create this wall. You can upload some sort of image or something that relates to that, and then that image can be pulled into schedules and things later for identification purposes. If there's anything special about this particular wall, you might have 100 different ones of this wall type, but maybe this one has something slightly different to it. This comment section allows you to just type something in there so that it will populate just for this wall. That being said, remember that properties here, anything that I identify or do in this window here is going to apply to this wall only. If I decide that I'm going to create another wall here that is the exact same wall type, anything that I do here is not going to affect that wall. Anything I do under edit type will affect both. So keep that in mind. If you upload a picture or make a comment or something here, it's going to show up on this one. It will not show up on that one unless you were to select both of them and then do it at the same time. So another thing that's down here is the mark. So this will throw some people off from time to time. The mark identifies this particular one. The type mark underneath here identifies all of them of that type. So if I were to tag this wall for mark and say maybe this is mark 1 and I go to tag this one is not going to have mark 1 unless I assign it mark 1 as well, which will probably give you a dialog box that tells you, hey, you have duplicates of mark 1 underneath here. So then down here is phasing. This comes into play if you're doing remodels or you're going in and changing old things out, new things in. You can identify what walls are existing, what walls are new, and then you can identify what things are going to be demolished and then set up in views what you want to see. So I could duplicate my level 1 and create 3 different versions of it. One where all I'm seeing is the existing stuff, and then all I'm seeing is the existing plus the demolished stuff, and then I could set up a third one that is, okay, what is all of the new stuff and how does that come into play? And then I could do a fourth one that just shows me the completed floor plan and doesn't really show a hierarchy between existing and new, just for a nice clean end of project sort of plan. So that's basically what these little things down here do. So getting into the edit type, so everything that is in here are things that will change all of my exterior brick and CMU on metal stud walls. So if all of a sudden I change wrapping at inserts to exterior, interior, or both, that will apply to all of my exterior brick and CMU on metal stud. If for whatever reason I want to change something about this one in particular that is in this kind of dialog box here, I need to duplicate this wall. and separate it from this type here. If I do not duplicate it, like I said, it's going to change all of them. Just be careful with that, because it's real easy when you're moving quickly within a project to jump in and say, okay, I need to change that. There it is. I punch something in, I change it, and then all of a sudden later on I go to a different part of the project and that same wall type has been changed too, and now I just caused myself a bunch of problems, and I've got to kind of track down what exactly I did to cause all these problems. Especially if you're working with a whole bunch of people, that is something that happens fairly frequently with novice Revit users, and it can be a little bit of a hassle and a pain chasing down all of the edit type property changes that people have made and not duplicated things out of it. So even if this is staying almost the exact same, but you're changing maybe the function of it, duplicate it, do an appendum onto the name of it. I would recommend developing some sort of naming convention. That way you can sort through your wall types, especially on large projects. It can be a real hassle scrolling through the wall types if you don't have a naming convention to try to find what you're after. So a little bit about what we've got here. So like I said, we're not going to get into the structural pieces of this, but this is where all of the layers of the wall are built up, their thicknesses, what kind of how they associate within each other, and what their functions are within that particular wall. This is also where you can add structural like pieces and reveals and sweeps, caps on the top, that sort of thing. So like we saw earlier, this has that concrete cap on the top. You would apply that down here. If you're ever wanting some sort of view, a preview of this, you can come down here and break out the preview. Even if you don't want to, like right now, we would never know that there's a concrete cap on the top of this. If we come down here and change this to section, we can see that there's a cap. There's also a soldier course built in, a couple of sweeps, creating some details, and then some sort of kind of ledge here. So that's basically a kind of brief overview of the structural component here, but I'm going to do an entire video on that because there are a lot of things you can get into there. So wrapping and inserts, what this does is at windows and at doors, how do you want that transition to happen? So let's say I put a door in here into this wall here. So right now it just chops all of these layers off, and that's how it's dealing with it, because it says do not wrap. So let's say I want the exterior to wrap it inserts, and I'll hit apply. Let's see if this wall type doesn't look like it's been set up real well for this. So I'm going to change a couple things here. So we'll turn a couple of little things off, and that should window as well. Whoops, I don't have my hotkeys in here. Okay, so interior, we will say both and see if that will work. So this wall type doesn't look like it's been set up so real well for this. So basically what would happen, I'll kind of walk through this a little bit, but what would happen is we've got an interior surface here, and if our window is set back in here, this, wherever the core element is, wherever the structural piece is of this wall, it would wrap to that. So if this window was set into the wall a little bit, this would wrap and continue. The brick on the exterior could wrap, especially if your windows are set back from, like on a brick exterior, your window probably isn't sitting out flush with your brick, so you're going to create some sort of detail of how that window sits within that wall and how that brick is going to engage the window there. So that will either wrap things inside or outside, especially on ends. So we've got function exterior wrapping at ends. We could say we want the exterior to wrap there, or we want the interior to wrap there. For whatever reason, this or whoops, it's an exterior wall. We want that one. For whatever reason, this wall type apparently hates doing any sort of wrapping ends or anything otherwise. This is a good lesson there are plenty of things out of the box in Revit that are just fine. There are also a lot of things that for quite a few versions now, they have not fixed the bugs in them. A lot of their components, if you try to change their sizes and stuff, the size will change, but some of the smaller pieces don't go with it. So if you change the size of the desk or the height of the desk or anything like that, the handles that are on the drawers stay where they are, and it just becomes a giant mess. So something to be aware of. Most of the time, I have, in my own template, I've actually purged most of the wall types out, and for each project, I start fresh and create my own for this exact reason, because going through and trying to figure out how somebody built somebody else's stuff and then why they aren't working can be a real pain. So moving on from that, let's actually see if we can grab one of these other wall types and see if we can get one of them to work. We'll do something simple like this and throw a window in there. We'll add whoops. Okay, I'm just going to add an extra layer there that does not wrap to see if we can get this to... There we go. Okay, so this is considered the exterior side of the wall. So you'll see this is my kind of core boundary here. This is my structural piece. So you'll see that exterior finish. When I said wrap exterior, this turned in at that point. And then if I change that to both, it'll wrap both sides. And so it'll come and meet both sides. Same thing with the wrapping at the ends. So if I say the exterior, I want that to wrap, it'll polish off the end there. So wrapping at the ends is one of the more important ones, especially because if you have a free end of a wall, you don't want all of your layers exposed on the end there. So having some sort of hierarchy set up for how that's going to transition, whether both sides are drywall or not, these both are drywall, so that's why it actually doesn't show a line where they break. Because it says this is finished to, this is finished to, they're both the same exact thing. So when they wrap to meet each other, it knows, okay, I don't need to show a line that these are breaking because this is all the same stuff. If I change this and I say, okay, this is going to be finish 1, all of a sudden that wrapping does something a little bit different at the ends. Whoops. Let's see, that one doesn't. For whatever reason, it doesn't want to give me that line. Maybe it's because it's both gypsum material applied to it. But either way, that kind of shows you exactly how those wrappings work there. For whatever reason, this particular one didn't want to do it. Well, now all of a sudden it did there. So moving on from that, we get into graphics. So coarse, scale, fill, pattern, fill, color. Like I said, down here we've got coarse, medium, fine. If you have a really small plan, you're not going to want to see near this much detail. You could throw it on coarse and you could say, okay, what do I want this wall to actually look like on coarse? You can override that and say, okay, I actually want this to use some sort of crosshatch. And so sometimes these hatches can get really intense. Maybe that looks a little too much. So you can back it off. This is what color that hatch is going to be. So maybe we back it off to like a light gray. And now that's a little more what you're after. Something like that. You can also, one of those fill patterns is also solid fill. So if you're just looking to do some sort of pochade wall type, you can throw that in there with a like a gray or a black or whatever you're after. Just to get everything to read kind of nicely. But we'll switch back to our fine detail mode, and because that's only a coarse scale fill pattern, that only applies when we've got the detail level set to coarse. So structural materials and stuff. This is just a kind of a material applied to whatever layer is considered the structure here. It's going to tell you, okay, what's my structural material within this wall? It says it's the metal stud layer in this aspect. Analytical properties. If you're going to use your model to analyze energy, that sort of thing, all of these kind of come into play. It automatically tabulates a lot of this based on what the material properties are that you built in here. So it's gonna kind of shoot out a thermal mass, thermal resistance, all of that sort of stuff automatically. I don't know a lot of people that are using this a whole lot just because of the accuracy of it, and there are programs built specifically for this kind of thing. And if you're really concerned about how perfect these numbers are, you're probably not using the built-in Revit features just yet. Like we mentioned before, under the properties, there are all sorts of identity data that we can associate with this particular wall type. So we could upload images of like maybe a section through this to show kind of how this is all working. We can add keynotes, model, if we're getting a specific manufacturer for maybe the exterior cladding, we can punch that in here. Excuse me. So any comments that we have about this entire wall assembly throughout the project, we can punch something in there that we can schedule later. Like I said, if you have a manufacturer that you're using here, you could upload a URL to their website, or maybe this is a UL assembly for a particular fire rating. Like down here, we could add a certain fire rating. You could add a URL to that UL assembly so that people could pull up additional information on that UL assembly. And then just a generic description of what it is. If it's something special or different, you can throw some sort of description in there. The type mark down here, this is the same as that mark in properties, only this applies to every single version of this in the entire project. So if you have a bunch of different wall types in your project, and say this is wall type A, you punch in A there, and then whenever you tag that particular wall type, it's going to tag as A. And then if you ever need to change that, you come in here, you change A to C, and every single one of those tags automatically will update. Like I mentioned the fire rating before, you punch something in there, or once I have multiple fire ratings throughout the project, you can just hit a drop down and it'll say half hour, hour, 2 hour, like that sort of thing, and you can just grab that. Cost. If you have a certain cost per lineal foot or something associated with that wall type, you could punch that in and run it through all sorts of analytics and stuff like that to try to figure out how many linear feet of that wall you potentially have and what's in a general cost of it. I don't know many people that are using that to that extent, just because there are so many factors that kind of come into play there. If it's just pulling it off of lineal footage, it's not taking into account waste factors, and if maybe this wall has 100 different windows in it, that's going to increase the cost a lot more than just a blank one. So little things like that all kind of come into play, and that's not really a wrinkle that is associated with this here. So that kind of runs you through the type properties and the properties windows of walls here. So beyond that, we're gonna get into the wall structure, and then the following video after the wall structure will be drawing walls and some advanced stuff that goes with drawing some more complex and